Out of all the people that they turn to first, parents ranked last for Gen Z. So yeah, naturally, the first place they're going to turn to is their phone. We spend 2 times longer researching mental health conditions than parents do. A lot of millennials opened a lot of these conversations talking about mental health. I think Gen Z just kind of more even fully embraced that and took that on.
Welcome to Thought Report. If you struggle with mental health, who do you turn to for help if you don't have access to a mental health professional? How do you look for information to find out if other people are experiencing the same thing? On this episode, we're going to talk about self-diagnosing. 20 years ago, you might have started by asking your friends or family for answers. 10 years ago, it might have started with a Google search, but that's no longer the case for most young people. A new study shows that 41% of Gen Z turn to social media for mental health education. That's second only to actually contacting a mental health professional. Now, I'd like to welcome my guest. Esther Fernandez is a senior copywriter for Made of Millions. That's the organization behind that report. Welcome to the show, and thanks for taking the time to speak to me.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Made of Millions it's a global nonprofit. You're trying to change how we perceive mental health issues. Your study is looking into how Gen Z is on a quest for better mental health care. Maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about Made of Millions and what you do for those who don't know it.
Yeah, so usually when I talk about Made of Millions, I like to start from the very beginning with our founder's story, Aaron Harvey. So when he was really young, he started getting really debilitating intrusive thoughts about harming people, sexual intrusive thoughts, really taboo in nature. And so naturally, when you're a child, you're really scared to explore that, speak up about it. And so he kind of just went decades of his life struggling and just silently, dealing with even things like substance use and suicidality because the thoughts were just so, pervasive, until eventually he kind of reached his breaking point and he Googled violent thoughts, and then popped up OCD, and he said, oh my goodness, can't believe that I spent my entire life not knowing what OCD was. It's so misrepresented in the media, especially I think his parents worked in healthcare. He said, how is this possible that I'm, in such a privileged position and yet I didn't know what this was? And he has a marketing background. He used to own an ad agency in New York. So naturally, he used all of those skills to create a website called intrusivethoughts.org, where he was teaching people about intrusive thoughts and OCD. But then from the little team that he pulled and the nonprofit he started, he realized that people were getting a lot of things wrong about mental health in general. And so we expanded to Made of Millions, and our name kind of means made up of the millions of people who struggle with mental health issues every single day. And so I found Made of Millions sort of similarly when I was struggling with OCD. They were one of the first resources that popped up. And eventually I joined the team, and we started doing a lot more social media things, and especially video content. And so, yeah, I'm a copywriter. So I kind of break up my job into 2 parts. There's the more editorial side, where I like to edit people's articles and interview people, and a lot of community management. But then there's also the social media aspect, where obviously, I manage our socials. I started our TikTok page and kind of grew a following there. And so a lot of what I do is mental health education, and kind of taking a lot of this complex clinical language, which again was kind of where Aaron's story started. He wanted people to, have accurate information in a way that didn't feel so cold and clinical, like a lot of mental health resources can kind of be. At the end of the day, mental health is a very human thing. And so we want to be able to relay that information in a way that's very relatable and can match with people's identities, but at the same time, we still need it to be accurate. So that's really at the root of what I do, what everyone on the Made of Millions team does. And then in relation to the study, we wanted to know, there's a lot of conversations around social media and self-diagnosis and mental health, and especially the youth mental health crisis. And as people who not only, everyone on our team in some way or another was helped by the internet, we turned to the internet, whether that comes to Googling what OCD means, or, just finding out more about whatever our condition is. We were all helped, but we were also like content creators, and we see the impact that these resources have on people every day. And yet it seems like the conversations we were seeing weren't accurately like reflecting that. It's either all social media is bad and every young person is getting, their diagnosis wrong and we need to fling our phones into the ocean and blah, blah, blah. Or it's like, oh, we need to heavily rely on all of these apps and chatbots and it's good. And so it just seems like people weren't entirely getting the full picture. And so we decided to step in and do this research study to sort of see what does the mental health journey actually look like for Gen Z. And so, yeah, I'll leave it there.
I think it's really interesting that you say that your founder actually started this whole journey by self-diagnosing
Yeah.
on Google.
Mhm.
I came across you guys on TikTok, and
Mhm.
there's one TikTok in particular, a recent one that's been seen over 200,000 times, which is about self-diagnosing. Can you talk a little bit about the benefits and maybe the risks that are in self-diagnosing that you find through your study?
Yes, I mean, that's such a loaded question because that's really at the root, I think, of this entire study that we did. I guess a lot of people have this misconception that young people are sort of turning to the internet because it's like, I'm not entirely sure what the narrative is. Like young people are having fun only turning to their phones when in reality that we have to start with a lot of systemic issues that are kind of driving people towards the internet. So obviously I can only speak in America because I live here, but the
Yeah.
healthcare system is a bit behind. We don't have universal healthcare. But I know even in like other countries, Canada, the UK, it can be really difficult to just access mental health care. And so it's also, you have to think about being a 13-year-old. They obviously don't know how to like navigate insurance plans. They don't know what specialized treatment looks like. These are all really big questions, but every 13-year-old has access to a phone. Every 13-year-old has access to the internet. It's what they're most comfortable with. It has all the information. So naturally, I think people are just trusting the internet starting when they're really young. It's a place to not necessarily get all the answers or to get all of their treatment, but just as a place where we call like a jumping point, just so that they can find out more information. So I think just sort of seeing it from that perspective where of course young people would want to go see a doctor, a therapist, but it's really hard to access that. They might not even entirely know what that process might look like. We also found I think out of all the people or resources that they turn to first, parents ranked last for Gen Z. So there's a distrust even within their own home turning to their parents. So yeah, naturally, the first place they're going to turn to is their phone. And just keeping that in mind, that's kind of the mindset that young people are in right now, is that they of course would want to go to a professional. Of course they'd want to trust their parents, but there is a distrust. There's this lack of access. And so they're turning to their phones. I think the pro to this is that there's so much information out there. And also when it comes to like algorithms and stuff, you can get more tailored information that you might have not gotten otherwise. Something that or even just like, getting information that you might have not even searched for. And I know this sounds really weird and vague, but I usually like to use OCD as an example. So like a lot of people don't know what OCD is. They might be having, intrusive thoughts and they're struggling. But with the magic of like social media, a video can pop up on your page. You don't even have to search for it, just giving you information saying, hey, these are just some symptoms. We're not going to diagnose you, because that's like the approach that I think I have a lot with our videos is we're just going to give you all of this information. And if this, is debilitating you, if this is like causing you to become non-functioning, which is kind of when we get into the area of like, now it's a disorder, you can't live your life, it's getting in the way of work and school, like all of these symptoms seem to align, then maybe you should go see a mental health professional to consult about it. Now, suddenly, again, a young person who used to have no language for it, no guidance, they didn't even know that this was like a thing. Suddenly they can go, oh, okay, I think this might be something that I'm interested in. And then they can go explore that a little bit further. The downsides to this, I think we mentioned this also in our report and also just on our social media pages in general, is that there is this sort of trend towards over pathologizing. A lot of people have seen, those things where it's like 5 signs you might have ADHD or trauma or whatever. And it might just be really like normal everyday things, or maybe things that are in response to normal stressful situations like school or world events and politics and stuff. Um, but even with that, I'm very hesitant. I just made a video about this. I'm very hesitant of people who look at, young people who are struggling and are just trying to make sense of what they're doing and kind of blaming them. But to me, I'm like, if a young person is just trying to figure out their symptoms, and even if they are over pathologizing or they're missing the mark on what their disorder is, wouldn't you want them to get guidance from a professional anyways? Wouldn't you want someone to teach them how to not over intellectualize, not over pathologize? Like, these are all tools that I think people are still like kind of demonizing, like their hunger for wanting more information. And yeah, even though they're missing the mark, I'm still like hesitant to blame young people, because at the end of the day, I think it does fall on like parents and school systems and doctors in order to teach them otherwise. So yeah, go ahead.
I think you really, hit the nail on the head there with that over pathologizing. I actually use social media myself to self-diagnose ADHD about 2 years ago. A few months later, I then saw a psychiatrist, and he suggested I try stimulant medication and see if that worked, and it did. It absolutely changed my life. In a strange timing coincidence, today I went to see another psychiatrist because I wanted to get like a proper ADHD assessment, like 2 years after being kind of diagnosed the first time. And it turns out I don't have all the traits that, I don't tick all the boxes for ADHD. So I don't actually have ADHD. So I've been thinking all day, have I been over pathologizing? Have I, seen all of this information and, come to the conclusion that I have ADHD? I mean, it turns out I do have a lot of the traits of, inattentive ADHD, which is normally diagnosed in women. And I just don't fit the criteria. I don't tick all the boxes on the, German healthcare form. So with that in mind, I was thinking about over pathologizing. Is there a tendency to do that? And in my case, I got a medication that actually helps me, but I don't actually fit the right box. So for
Right.
me, it's a good thing.
You bring up such a good, okay, I'll touch on your point maybe in a bit, and you might have to remind me on your question on over pathologizing specifically, but I also just made a video about this, so I'm like, this is really interesting and I love this conversation, which is what is the role that self-diagnosis and diagnosis plays in general. And I do want to remind people that, again, I can only speak on the US. The US can be very like medical model, focused on diagnostics and symptoms and the DSM. But just a reminder that like the people who invented all of these boxes were us, and we're allowed to change them and update them. And also, what is the purpose even of a diagnosis, and putting all of these symptoms into certain groups and saying this is this diagnosis and this is this diagnosis, especially when you start getting into comorbidities and people have so many different conditions that suddenly all of these symptoms are overlapping. Where does it start? Where does it end? What treatments do you even do? And I always say, like, the reason why we even put them into these categories is so that we can understand how to treat them better. And at the end of the day, we want people to be functioning again in order to do the things that they value and they like. When we even define what a disorder is, it's something that impacts your daily functioning. It affects things like your work, your schooling, your relationships, even small things like eating and sleeping, and how you can enjoy socializing with people. And so I always say, is it necessary to get an official diagnosis? For a lot of people, no, it's not always necessary. Like you said, maybe you got the right medication that you needed and it was enough to see certain symptoms and to talk with a psychiatrist and a professional and say, okay, this might be something that benefits you, and you took it and it is helping you function again. And maybe it's not something that you need to take every day for like years and years. Some people take it for a little bit. For some people, it's like a lifelong thing and it helps them function at like baseline. I was also going to talk about the harm that can sometimes come from self-diagnosis, which is that for some people, like OCD, for example, I use OCD as an example a lot, but not a lot of mental health professionals might be aware of what it even is. Sometimes there can be a lot of stigma around it, whether it comes from like the workplace. There's a lot of like teachers or parents who might be scared to talk about harm intrusive thoughts or sexual intrusive thoughts, because sometimes there is like stigma that can be like, sometimes we've heard of people even like losing their jobs, which isn't to say we're trying to scare people from getting an official diagnosis, but sometimes there's real risk, even with things like schizophrenia, BPD, borderline personality disorder is like so stigmatized, especially in like healthcare circles. There's a lot of people who won't even treat clients with BPD because it's too hard to treat. So sometimes therapists will advise their clients like, hey, we don't need to put BPD in your chart because it can affect like the level of care that you receive. So yeah, sometimes for some people, they don't need the official diagnosis. I know for me, I don't know if I even officially got an OCD diagnosis, and I don't really have the strong desire to. I saw a specialist and we did like a bit of a screening, and she was like, yeah, I think you have it. And clearly I researched a lot through a lot of, credible sources, like the IOCDF and Made of Millions, and checking in with like mental health professionals. So for some people, it is enough just to like talk to a professional or two and get screened, and they don't need it officially in their chart.
So do you think labels are more important to some people than to others?
I think, yeah, I think it's one of those things where I think it depends on each person, especially when labels can be very validating. And sometimes people do need that validation, that they need that group of people that they can turn to, a community they can turn to where they can get the skills that they need in order to get better in life. Also, as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about people of marginalized identities, or like you said, people who might not entirely fit what we stereotypically think of certain things. I know with ADHD, they might, like you said, in attentive disorder, they say you typically see it in women. So sometimes it might help to have that label and to get that validation to go, okay, I actually do have that thing, in spite of this being like the common perception of like people who normally have it. I know people of color also experience the same thing when it comes to ADHD, that they might not even be labeled as ADHD, because a lot of the times it's for like young white boys. So women experience that a lot. People of color experience that a lot. So again, these labels actually might help them to feel more validated and say, okay, I actually do have this thing. I just really think it depends from person to person.
And also in your report, you do touch on marginalized communities,
Yes.
like, for example, people of color or indigenous people, how they are actually more likely to self-diagnose because of the lack of professional help. How can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, let's talk about this. Yeah, we found that Gen Z BIPOC respondents, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, were 4 times more likely to choose self-diagnosis over clinical diagnosis because they wanted to avoid labels and stigmas associated with a clinical diagnosis. So sometimes, yeah, it works the other way, where it's like, I actually don't really want that official label on me. It's enough for sort of my own validation, like only I need to know that this is a thing. And again, I think I sort of bring it back to like the initial question that I brought up in the beginning, which is, why do we have all of these labels and diagnoses in the first place? And at the end of the day, it's to help people become functioning, and not even in just like a capitalistic, you need to make as much money and go out and be functioning kind of, but genuinely functioning as in, I want to have relationships with people that are healthy. I want to be able to live my life and do the things that I love and I enjoy. And yeah, I think it's just, I think people, when they jump into extremes, or when they say you can only diagnose this way, or only clinical diagnosis is a valid diagnosis, I just think we miss so many nuances. So I think really at the end of the day, what our report really paints the picture of, and what a lot of Made of Millions does, is that you have to be able to hold many different, perspectives at the same time. People can use the internet in order to inform themselves and to find something that maybe they might not see in mainstream media. And at the same time, it is, important to go see a professional if it's possible, if there aren't too many risks, if it doesn't put you in danger, if it's, affordable. Like, we really want to push both things at the same time and see the pros and cons to both of them.
I mean, we're talking about Gen Z here. Your report focuses on young people. Is Gen Z experiencing a mental health crisis that is different from other generations?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we have to point to social media. I think it's very unique how before you used to get your news from like TV, from the newspaper, from friends and family. And also, there was a bit of a delay when it came to getting all of this news. I think my generation grew up in this very interesting era where everything is live and instantaneous and very global. So it's not just that you're hearing about a war that's breaking out through the newspaper the next morning. You are watching live streams of people who are being hurt. You are watching live streams of people who are explaining what's happening, someplace in some country that you didn't even know. You're like so informed on things that you just didn't even know you could be informed on, whether that's politics or disease or like even a global global warming events. I know in LA, we had some wildfires recently, and obviously that got like global attention, and that can be really distressing for people to see. And yeah, I'm Gen Z, and I just remember growing up on Twitter a lot. Even that seems kind of small, but I just remember even seeing conversations happening in real time as I was seeing a bunch of political events unfold. A lot of people saying this is so strange that like young people are during such developmental years, like experiencing all of these things in real time. So I do think that has had like a profound effect on young people. I know in our report, we talk about a lot of feelings of existentialism and nihilism and doomerism because we just have so much information, and it can be kind of hard to feel so helpless because you don't entirely know what to do. So I will say that that has influenced, I think, the way young people's mental health is today. That's very different from older generations.
You talked earlier about how parents are literally the last resort for Gen Z when it comes to seeking help. What do you think are some of the biggest disconnects between Gen Z and older generations when it comes to mental health?
There's this really interesting quote from one of our doctors, Dr. Jody Adewale, and he talked about how older generations tend to see mental health as something that you just kind of like fix and then move on. That in his practice, he tends to see parents come in for like, the standard like 10 sessions, fix this issue, and then they move on. Whereas I think Gen Z sees mental health as like a lifelong thing and something that we can't get enough of. We want to work on.
It's important to point out, Gen Z is really helping older generations with their own problems, right? Like, full disclosure, I'm an older millennial. Some might even call me Gen X. But I have learned so much about my own mental health from, 20-year-olds on the internet. So Gen Z are helping the older generations. Is it going the other way as well? Is Gen Z getting the support that they need from the older generation?
Yeah, I think older generations are definitely, I would also argue, say you're like closer to millennial. A lot of millennials opened a lot of these conversations talking about mental health. I think Gen Z just kind of more even fully embraced that and took that on. And we were like, okay, like, let's continue these conversations. I will say, going back a little bit to what you were just talking about, older generations versus younger, that older generations tend to look to healthcare professionals and they kind of just trust the first person that they find. They think that, if you're a doctor, if you're a psychiatrist, like you obviously have to know what you're talking about. But as we explore our research a little bit more, we realize the importance of like specialized treatments, especially when it comes to more, I guess, specialized conditions like ADHD, OCD. The reality is that not every healthcare professional is going to know everything about everything. And so I think it's interesting how young people are turning to the internet in order to kind of like vet the information and vet the clinicians that they're even searching for. It's really wild because I think, our generation is kind of the first to even, we go on the internet and we go, okay, what do I think I have? Let me spend some time researching. We spend 2 times longer researching mental health conditions than parents do. And we're also less likely to get misdiagnosis, again, compared to parents who just kind of go to the first clinician that they see. Young people are taking their time with researching these things, and we show up to the therapist's office with questions. We're like, how long have you been doing this? Like, we're just coming in like very prepared and we know what we want. And so I think the way older people can sort of help young people is listening to the research that they're doing, and they can also take the time to research as well. There's nothing that like warms my heart more than hearing parents like listening to podcast episodes, like even stuff like this, and really
like
taking
this one.
Yeah, like this one, and taking the time to have these conversations and inform themselves and listen to actual like Gen Zers who are doing the research, who are like have lived experience with these conditions, instead of just assuming. Again, that's where like I get really frustrated, just assuming that all young people don't know what they're talking about and they're just searching for attention. So yeah, I would just say older generations should listen more and research more and sit down with the young people in their life and truly listen to what they're searching for, because the reality is they're probably searching for things in a much more nuanced, informed way than I think people realize that they are, but they just don't take the time to actually listen to them.
I think that's so important what you're saying. And for years, I was in that, the older generation category. I would just, go to a health professional, and whatever they told me, it was like, okay, this is what it is. And I think
Mhm.
especially with mental health care, it's
Mhm.
different from other types of mental health care, because you can go to one specialist and they will tell you one thing, and you'll go to another and they'll tell you something slightly different.
Right.
And then, so the first one you go to, I'm not saying that any of them are bad, but,
Mhm.
it's the mental health is not, fact.
Right.
It's an area where, there is differing opinions.
Right. You bring up a really good point. I just wanted to bring up, like, I remember someone saying some analogy in the mental health space where it's like there's so many different specialists, like, to what you're saying. And if you have a broken arm, you wouldn't go to like a leg specialist. Same thing. If you have ADHD and you just go to the first therapist you see, and maybe they're treating you with like anxiety tools, it's like that match isn't going to work. So I think, again, people are so scared of turning to the internet in order to search for support. We're not saying that you should only turn to the internet and treat yourself through the internet and like that's the only way. We're saying the internet is really important for seeing all of your options, finding what's evidence-based, finding what's aligning with you. And then when you go into the doctor's office, again, similar to like a first date, you can see what you do and don't like, what modalities you're searching for, what personality you're searching for. And I remember saying like sometimes that therapeutic alliance that you form can sometimes even be more important than, or not more important, but just as important as what they are treating you with, because someone can have the right information, but if they don't click with you, then it's kind of going to be useless. So that's what I'm saying. Like young people are informed about these kinds of discussions. They're going into all of these like appointments knowing that they want to vet their clinicians. And I think, yeah, a lot of older generations don't always have that in mind. They just kind of blindly trust the first person that they see, which to your point, again, we're not saying mental health professionals are bad. We're just saying it's good to be informed before you even enter the doctor's office.
Do you think that Gen Z mindset is actually changing the profession? And do you think this self-diagnosis will then continue, or will it kind of fade if better mental health care replaces it?
Yeah, I think it's certainly raising questions. And I think there are a lot of clinicians who are a little bit more open to it. I think there is still a bit of hesitancy from a lot of clinicians, which I think is interesting. I mean, so much of the work that I do is very OCD related. And I think a lot of the clinicians that I've talked to when I talk about OCD things, even with my own therapist, she's not an OCD specialist, but I will like point her to information. And they're always really grateful to have like their clients teach them things. I think it really, I guess, depends on the therapist. But yeah, for the most part, I think a lot of conversations in medical spaces are starting, but there is still so much resistance. And even my friend, Uma Chatterjee, she's like a neuroscientist who's studying OCD and PTSD, and she has lived experience with like mental health conditions. But she tells me that in a lot of these more research medical spaces, that there is stigma against people who have lived experience, which I think is so interesting. I'm like, wouldn't you want people who live through it to be the ones leading the research? But there can be a lot of stigma with mental health professionals, even like living with these conditions. So I think that's really interesting. I would hope that it's helping influence people. And I think in the future, you bring up like if we have changes, would this affect how people are self-diagnosing and stuff? I think in an ideal world, if we have all of these systemic issues fixed, people would be getting their psychoeducation not from the internet. Ideally, I think people should be getting it, through accurate screenings in their primary care providers' offices, like their pediatricians, when they're starting really young. They'll be getting psychoeducation in schools from their parents. The media will be sharing accurate representations, and people will have like a better baseline understanding, which again, I think was another statistic in our research where when we asked people what would prevent them from like dropping out or from continuing to research things, or what would make their mental health journey better, people said that a baseline education of mental health would be really important. So people want that education in the beginning. And to me, psychoeducation when you're really young is preventative care. If people actually understood the signs of ADHD, of OCD, if parents were able to spot these symptoms in their children, if doctors would be able to like have more nuanced conversations with their clients and say a little kid comes in with intrusive thoughts, but because it's like invisible and like they might not have like physical compulsions pairing with those intrusive thoughts, like, but the clinician is still well informed enough to be able to ask these questions and to spot all these things, then people could get care earlier. And obviously, the longer you go without knowing that you have these symptoms and these conditions, the worse that these things can get and the more harmful coping skills that you develop, and it just takes longer to like undo. So again, like in a perfect world, I don't think like it's both heartbreaking and also heartwarming when I get comments of like kids who are teenagers and they're like, wow, I never knew that this was a thing. Like you just taught me about X, Y, or Z. I'm going to go talk about this with like a professional. We get so many messages of people saying that, you know, you helped me get diagnosed with X, Y, or Z, a lot of OCD. But I'm like, wow, that's incredible that I helped you like go towards the right resources and like you finally got the help that you needed. But I'm also like, why am I the one helping you like, why is a TikTok the one teaching you this when you should have known this way younger? Someone should have caught this when you were way younger. You should have gotten these resources from the moment, you know, they were beginning. Ideally, the time between symptom onset and diagnosis should be close to zero. You know, like people should be able, the moment they have some sort of symptom, to be able to identify and to be able to know where to turn to. I mean, that's a lot to ask of young people, which again, that's why I'm pointing it a lot towards parents and mental health professionals in order to be able to spot these things. But yeah, in my ideal world, we wouldn't be really needing the internet to get these answers because people should already be having them in the first place.
Esther Fernandez, this has been a brilliant chat. Thank you so much for all your valuable insights, and thank you for all the research you've done at Made of Millions. And for those watching or listening, if you want to find out more about Made of Millions, go to their TikTok account where you will meet Esther. That's it for the show. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. And please leave a comment about anything we've talked about today. If you want to reach out, you can find us on Instagram and on TikTok. The handle you need there is @ThoughtReport. Thanks very much for your company. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Yeah. I should have warned you. I'm like, I talk a lot. You ask me a question and I just blah, 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 blah. I'm like, I can go off for like 10 minutes.